Sara Wenger Shenk. I'm a longtime friend of Daniel. We go all the way back to college together. Daniel's story, Search for a Blessing, a gay man's journey from a Mennonite missionary childhood to the streets of AIDS activism. He chooses to frame it with a biblical story excerpted right at the beginning of the book, which I will read. That night, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. The man saw that he could not overpower him and said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man said, "You have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Then he blessed him there. Genesis chapter 32. Now our Daniel, needed to go to a very deep, vulnerable place to tell his story. And it was his niece, Joyce Shenk Maxwell, who with her careful listening drew him out. The courage arose and the story emerged in a way that is written for all of us to share in it, to learn from it. I do believe that it would have stayed hidden away deep inside his inner consciousness and body had Joyce not drawn it out and written it up so beautifully. Joyce Shenk Maxwell is Daniel's niece, also a child of missionary parents, a freelance writer and editor, and a global citizen who has lived in Kenya, Uganda, and Ghana, I believe. Joyce will introduce us to what will come next.
Thank you, Sara, for that warm introduction. My job here today is very easy. What we are planning is to just have 3 readings from Dan Shenk, my uncle, who, as many of you know, was the youngest child of a Mennonite missionary family who was raised in rural Tanzania and spent his adult life in chaplaincy work, mostly in New York City. How did that happen? And in the corrections system, and was an activist in service to people living with HIV/AIDS, and also my dear uncle. And Sara Wenger Shenk. We are so many Shenks here today, but the blood relations are very tenuous. The lines are very tenuous there. Now retired president of AMBS Seminary in Indiana, and a writer extensively in church and academic publications, and a grandmother with lovely grandkids. So we're going to have 3 readings, and Sara will help create the bridge the different readings from one to the next. Then there will be a question and answer, chance for book signings. There are books for sale back here. Thank you to Parentheses for hosting this event for us today. The excerpts that Dan is reading were condensed a bit, so he will actually be reading from a handout with a larger print, easier to read in this setting. So, but the excerpts are from the book. So welcome, Dan.
So this is definitely a shock to the system. The last time this many people were gathered together having something to do with me was when I was ordained in the winter of 1985. So it's amazing, and to see so many faces. I didn't know that I really knew so many people in Harrisonburg. I moved down here a year and a half ago, and I want to say I'm really grateful. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to begin at least by reading. And I'm going to dive right in. It is taken from the book. And it comes under the section called Seeds of Sacrifice, Seeds of Faith. I was born and raised in a Mennonite missionary family committed to life of service in East Africa. And for me, because of that, there was a price to pay. One of my last memories of my family being all in one continent was the day I turned 4. Our family was on furlough from the mission field in East Africa and living in a house in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for the year. Until that year in Pennsylvania, my parents and my 4 siblings and I had lived together on the Mennonite mission station of Bumangi in Tanganyika, now called Tanzania. How many people here have been to Bumangi? Quite a few. So that was where my parents had started that mission in 1936, and that's where they were living. And when my family returned to Africa after the furlough I'm referring to, my eldest brothers, David and Joe, stayed behind to live with extended family and attend high school. So my parents, along with me, John, and our big sister, Anna Catherine, set out on the voyage without them. By the time we embarked on a ship to East Africa, my parents, Clyde and Alta, had already devoted 17 years to mission work in what was known as Tanganyika before independence. My father had been sickly as a boy, but as a man was tall and lanky. My diminutive mother was warm and friendly, quick to hug and show physical affection. They were part of a community of American Mennonite mission workers on 6 stations tucked up into a northern corner of Tanzania, bordering Lake Victoria and Kenya. The area was still largely rural. The town of Musoma on the shore of the lake was the main commercial center. As part of the long journey by boat and train, we sailed from England to Eastern Africa on the Kenya Castle, an old ship on its last voyage. I shared a cabin with Anna Catherine and Elsie Cressman, a young Mennonite woman who was joining the mission effort in Tanganyika. She was going to work with leprosy patients. The American Mennonite missionaries in East Africa were like an extended family, with adults being like aunts and uncles and age mates being like cousins. On the lower bunk, which was my bed, I sometimes played with the bulb of the light fixture just above my pillow. I'm lucky I didn't get electrocuted. Once the steward caught me and was really upset. He described all the nasty things he would do to me and summed up his diatribe with the threat, "After all that, you'll be dead, and then I'll throw you overboard." I was entranced and terrified. Miss Cressman read me a children's book at several bedtimes in our cabin on the boat. It was about a farmer, and it introduced me to the story of salvation. On the farm in the story were a hen and her clutch of peeps. One night a fire broke out. The farmer was surveying the charred wreckage the next morning when he kicked at a clump of ashes. Out from under the clump, all that remained of the mama hen, which was all that remained of the mama hen, came running these peeps. The hen had covered her chicks and sacrificed herself to save their lives. At the end of this book was a picture of Jesus on a cross, and the story went on to say that this is what Jesus did for people. Like the mother hen, he covers us from the wages of sin, which is death, and he protects us. My introduction to the salvation story was that someone was being sacrificed. I connected with the image of the hen dying to protect her chicks. The connection with Jesus being sacrificed for our sins came later. The message I got was that the stakes were high, and the universe is not a safe place. Being rescued is a big deal. My sense of the unsafe world was being confirmed by some of the adults on that voyage, like the steward who had threatened me. The Mennonites' mission was to bring the Christian story of salvation to people who hadn't heard it. As a child, I felt that sense of mission consistently, even relentlessly. The mission was of supreme importance. This deep commitment also became the basis for the many painful separations my immediate family members experienced. While it was hard for me to understand what was ahead when we disembarked in Africa, I soon learned that my brother John and my sister Anna Catherine would live far away from us at boarding school for most of the year. Throughout my childhood, Mother put our family situation into perspective by saying, she would say this often, we're in this together. The separations we experience are a sacrifice we make because of our love for Jesus. So that sacrifice set the trajectory of my life.
Another framing quote at the beginning of the book that you chose, Daniel, from Adelbert Stifter. Pain is a holy angel who reveals treasures that otherwise would remain hidden forever. Through him, humans have become greater than through all the world's joys. Now, I know it's a long way from your childhood in Tanzania to AIDS activism on the streets of New York City. And there was a lot of pain along that way, and a lot of treasure that helped to buoy you, a lot of goodness that helped to keep you going, make you resilient. Tell us a little bit about that journey from East Africa to New York.
In my life, a lot of people seem to have choices. They make certain goals earlier in their lives, and they make choices toward those goals. I never had the goal of being a chaplain. My experience was that doors kept opening in that direction. The summer between my junior and senior year of college, my father was getting married again. My mom had died the year before. He was getting married to Miriam Wenger, and my stepsister, Netta, is here today. And I was all for the marriage, but it was pretty quick. And it turned out to be a really incredible, phenomenal partnership. But I didn't want to be in Lancaster that summer. So the door opened very unexpectedly for me to do work study on a prison farm in Southampton County, Virginia. And that's how I first got into corrections. Doors kept open. I never had the goal of living in New York. But again, the whole story is around that. The door opened in that direction.
What is it that made New York City feel like home?
We can't hear back here. Could it be turned up any?
Sorry,
Please.
can the speaker be turned?
We can maybe hold it a little closer. We will hold it closer. Is that better?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
That's harder to do.
Okay.
You were, when you were in high school at Lancaster Mennonite School, and graduating, hopefully, suddenly encouraged to take up a job in New York City as superintendent of some two buildings. And you got to New York City and discovered Something about the city felt good and right for you. What was it about the city that did that for you?
So my first 2 years of high school were at Rift Valley Academy in Kenya. And then my parents came to the States. I was 16. And left me to live with an aunt and uncle in Lancaster, and they returned. And going to Lancaster Mennonite High School was not a good fit. And having been born outside of the Mennonite community, it was the situation at the school was very homogeneous. Everybody had grown up Mennonite, and my parents were Mennonite. We hadn't been living in the Mennonite community. So it was painful. And then I flunked a final exam in economics, so I couldn't graduate with the class. So it was a kind of an unhappy situation. And the job market was very, very scarce in Lancaster that summer of 67. And I was looking for a job, and I remembered that Dave Bumberger, who'd married a missionary kid, Lois Leatherman. Her parents were John and Lois Leatherman. And he lived in New York City, and he'd fallen in love with it, and he had these 2 apartment buildings. And he needed somebody to be his janitor. So to make a long story short, that was the connection. I went to New York City. A lot of people go to New York for graduate degrees, or many of my friends have gone to New York to get in the whole theater scene. I went to be a janitor. And suddenly I felt free, because in New York everybody was different. I no longer felt different. It was a good fit.
So after that initial foray to New York City, you returned and came here to the Valley, to college at Eastern Mennonite College, with strong family, parental encouragement to reconnect with your Mennonite community. And then, as you said, you got into some corrections work in the Southampton area, is that right? And then something took you back to New York, which was to study at Union Theological Seminary, where again you connected well, made all kinds of new friends, but returned to Virginia, Southern Virginia, to the job you had been in before. And that felt good and right, and in many ways was bringing out all of the best in you. And yet there was something that wasn't lining up for you. There was a dilemma for you that went to the heart of the integrity of who you were, that took you back to New York. Would you tell us about that briefly?
Yeah. So, after graduating from Union, it's a whole story how I got to Union, but that's in the book. After graduating from Union, Chaplain Service of Virginia, I reached out to them. Chaplain Service of Virginia was an incredible organization, and now that I've moved down here, I want to sort of reach out and find out if they're still in existence, if they go by the same name. But Chaplain Service of Virginia was supported by the Protestant churches in the state, and they provided chaplains in the key prison situations in the state, and which was an incredible setup because it meant that they weren't beholden to the state. They had an element of freedom in their thinking and in their ministry, and they invited me to come back. And again, it's in the memoir. I was at Virginia State Penitentiary for 3 years, which is a story in itself. But they liked my work and they wanted me to stay. But the one problem they had was I wasn't ordained. And I affiliated with Powhatan Mennonite Church, and I was beginning to move toward ordination. But I was gay. And I really recoiled from the thought of being ordained and ministering and being supported by people who did not know this. And I wasn't willing to live a double life. And after a lot of thinking and prayer, I decided I would go back to New York. And they thought I was crazy. Another thing that happened was that the minister, Louis Burkholder, Powhatan Mennonite Church at the time, had a beautiful daughter. And she took me out rowboating one afternoon, and she was fantastic. And so all the pieces were there for an incredible professional life, but there was this one issue. And I decided I would give up everything and go back to New York. And they all thought I was kind of crazy, and they didn't understand why. Yeah.
So now, pick up with your next reading.
Okay, I was back in New York, still young, still seeking ordination. I eventually became ordained through Judson Memorial Church. And I was offered a job with a very high-sounding title, Director of Pastoral Care of the Council of Churches of the City of New York. And it was the Protestant Council of Churches. And they hired me to be Director of Pastoral Care. And one of the key duties in that role was to be supportive of chaplains working in hospitals run by the Health and Hospital Corporation. There were, and I think still to this day, there are 5 hospitals that are run by the city. And of course, New York City has many, many, many private hospitals. The most famous of those 5 is Bellevue Hospital. It keeps coming up in the literature. It's talked about. Everybody seems to know about Bellevue. It's run by the city. And the council of churches have the duty of keeping those chaplains accountable, making sure that their clinical training was up to snuff. And when there would be vacancies, the council of churches had a committee that would review candidates to fill vacancies. And so in '82, a delegation from the Haitian community came to the council of churches to say that their community was being targeted, they were being discriminated against, more beyond the fact that they were Haitians, because the press was reporting that AIDS was beginning to appear within the Haitian community. And so the discrimination was increasing, and they wanted the council to do something about that. And very shortly after that, we began to hear that, I began to hear that AIDS was appearing in these hospitals run by the Health and Hospital Corporation. So I wanted the chaplains working in these hospitals to be prepared for what was coming. And I invited all of them to talk about what was happening. I invited them to Bellevue Hospital because it had a lot of space. But hardly anybody came, and there were approximately 12 Protestant chaplains, maybe 15 Protestant chaplains working in all these different hospitals. And actually, no one came except for Meade Bailey, who was assigned to Bellevue. It was his hospital anyway. And my take on the fact that chaplains didn't show up was because I think that they were afraid of being accused of being gay. Because at that point, AIDS was viewed as a disease that was spreading within the gay community. And so there were people that recoiled from being part of anything having to do with AIDS. But Meade Bailey was 100% for the fact that I'd reached out to him, and he said, I'm dealing with AIDS, it's a big issue. At that point, there wasn't a lot of understanding about how the disease was transmitted. We knew it could be transmitted through sex, but there were many unknowns. And for example, at Bellevue Hospital, like many places, AIDS patients often would have their meal trays left outside the doors of their rooms. Staff was afraid to go in for fear of contagion. So Meade had blue-collar sensibilities, and he loved going to Julius's Bar, a grassroots bar in the West Village that attracted blue-collar worker types. Long before AIDS was a concern, Julius's had been a gathering place where leaders in the gay community spontaneously had meetings in the back room of the bar. They were hanging out and drinking anyway, so it just made sense to congregate in the back room. And me, because of that, because of going to Julius's, he knew some of the key leaders in the gay community. And he told me they were becoming increasingly concerned that gay men were losing apartments because they were getting sick, they couldn't work, couldn't pay rent. In some cases, maybe 2 or 3 men were sharing an apartment, and if one got AIDS, the others kicked him out. It would happen, and it was a horrible situation. Because of my new friendship with Meade, I became involved with the Julius's group. The first thing we did was set up a fishbowl at Sheridan Square, which is at the top of Christopher Street, if you know anything about the West Village, only 2 blocks from Julius's Bar. And we brought an actual fishbowl and put out word that we were collecting money to help people pay their rent. Passers-by were invited to contribute. I was a regular volunteer. I was there at the end of the workday. I stuck around on weekends too. We would collect several $100s every weekend. We would count out the money and share it out with people having a hard time financially. And this was, of course, before the city had done anything, put anything in place to help people with AIDS pay their rent. So we were a strange amalgamation of volunteers, religious sorts like me, Bailey, and Meade. We're hanging out with complete agnostics. Many of them had a lot of anger toward the religious community because of the way they've been treated by the religious community over the years. And there were some real radical types that began to hang out with us who felt disenfranchised by gay men's health crisis. GMHC had started 2 years before, and it was started by a group of financially secure, well-educated gay men. And they began to organize, and their main goal at that point was to provide educational seminars to the gay community about safe sex. And they were also lobbying very strongly for support from the federal government. It was 3 years before Ronald Reagan ever said the word AIDS in those first 3 years. So in this group, it was sort of a class because the people that became affiliated with AIDS Resource Center felt that GMHC was kind of snooty, upper class. So it was kind of a class issue. The people who became part of AIDS Resource Center were feeling angry with GMHC, and there was one person in particular, his name was Richard Locke. He was a gay porn star, one of the radicals. One of his 3 movies was Kansas City Trucking, and their bodies were clobbered. I've often thought that even the devil couldn't have invented a more horrible disease. One of my friends, a Jesuit priest, told me about how he'd gone to visit somebody in the AIDS community, went to his apartment. Bill McNichols, the Jesuit, heard that this guy had AIDS. And he just opened the door a crack, and his face was just covered with lesions from Kaposi sarcoma. Kaposi sarcoma was a disease that had been primarily in the Mediterranean. Older men in the Mediterranean would have it, and all of a sudden it's appearing in New York City with all these attractive men. So there was a friend, Robert, that I met through Judson Memorial Church. Suddenly, in the midst of a full, beautiful life, Robert became sick. He began to see a team of naturopathic doctors. They put him on some sort of herbal regimen, which they said would cleanse his system. But he was not getting better. And this continued for several months. But Robert was adamant about staying with this naturopathic regimen that was not working. Then he began to run a fever. And of course I became really concerned. Even then he insisted on continuing with this, quote, cleansing process, unquote. Then he developed horrible diarrhea. Even then he wanted to believe that the diarrhea was his body's way of cleansing itself from the, quote, negativity, unquote, from his earlier life. His childhood had been extremely unhappy. And in his mind, his body was ridding itself of all of that negativity from his childhood. There came a night when I stayed with him in his apartment, and he was clearly in deep crisis. He had constant diarrhea, too weak to get back to the bathroom. Early in the morning, I sat up with him all night, and early in the morning, he finally acquiesced. Okay, I'll go to the hospital. We called 911, and I went with him in the ambulance to the hospital, and he was admitted and tested for HIV. Back then, it would take 3 days before you would get the results of a test. So we had these 3 days of incredible anxiety. And I was with him in the hospital room when a call came in from his doctor, who told him, Robert, you do have AIDS. And it was such a traumatic moment. Robert just broke out in this cold sweat. And around that time, he also developed Kaposi sarcoma. What did I call it before? Kaposi sarcoma. Skin cancer known to primarily affect older men in the Mediterranean. So Robert developed Kaposi sarcoma. And it developed on the soles of his feet. Again, the most vulnerable places in your body. He didn't get it on his face, but he really had it on his feet. And in addition to that, he could hardly breathe at times. During that hospitalization, he was also told that he had pneumocystis pneumonia. Many medical people here may be familiar with it. It's a parasitic form of pneumonia. And there was a treatment for it, which he submitted to, an antiretroviral medication. And those antiretroviral medications have really been developed now, and they make it possible for people to have long-term survival living with AIDS. So he beat the pneumocystis, was released from the hospital, and he reconciled himself that he was really going to have to live with AIDS now. So he closed his hair salon, and he had a little salon set up in his apartment where he would see clients, still had some money coming in. But he told me from the very beginning, after his diagnosis, that if he saw the ravages of this disease, and he said that if it ever comes to my becoming really, really ill and the quality of life being dramatically diminished, I want to take my life. And he found a doctor who was cooperative with this idea of taking his own life if he decided to do so. About 1.5 years after the hospitalization, Robert felt the time had come. He felt that life had ceased to have meaning. He could no longer work. He could no longer experience intimacy with people that he loved because of all the pain he was in. He felt his life had become extremely empty. So he set on a certain day, and again, in a discussion, I'm going on maybe too long here, so I want us to have time to talk. He picked a day. He said, this is going to be it. And I told him I would meet at his apartment and be with him, but I did not want to be with him when he took his medication. It was Seconal, powerful, short-acting barbiturate. So the night before the day, I didn't go home. I stayed with another friend, Charlie. And the two of us got up early and went to his apartment. We took a cab to his doctor's office. The doctor gave him a shot of Valium to keep Robert from throwing up the lethal dose of Seconal. Because of the painkillers he was taking, plus the Valium injection, Robert was able to walk to Judson Church to find Howard Moody, the minister. So if any of you are familiar with the village, the West Village in Lower Manhattan, Washington Square Park is a very dominating feature. And Fifth Avenue comes into Washington Square Park to a T. And amazingly, his doctor's office was only 2 blocks north of Washington Square Park on Fifth Avenue. So he was given the injection. I witnessed it. It was only about a 3-minute session. And Robert walked, and his apartment, and then Judson Memorial Church is in the south side of Washington Square Park, and then his apartment is only 2 blocks from Judson Church. So all of these places were all lined up. And we got to the church, and Howard Moody, the senior minister, joined us. He was one of the people in the know. And he put his arm around Robert in a spontaneous kind of supportive gesture. And I was walking behind them, and it seemed to me kind of reminiscent of Howard walking somebody to his baptism. So Howard walked him the 2 blocks to Robert's apartment. We went up to 5 flights to where he lived. And again, I told him many times, if you do this, I don't want to be here when you take the medication. That's not something I agreed to. On the way to the apartment, he asked me to stop at a deli and buy a container of cider. And shortly after Howard, Robert, and me entered Robert's apartment, he goes in the back and comes out after about 5 minutes. We thought he'd gone back to urinate or something. He came back and he laid down on his futon, and he said something innocuous like, does anybody have an AIDS joke? And then suddenly he was out, just bam. So it wasn't a gradual falling asleep, getting sleepy, falling asleep. So then we realized that he'd taken the barbiturate back in the bathroom. He tricked us. So we looked at each other in shock, and we decided to leave immediately. And we decided that in a couple hours, we decided not to wait till the next morning in case rigor mortis would set in. We decided I would go back in 3 hours. And I'm not sure why they decided I would go back alone, but that was what happened. I went back alone. I went into the apartment, and clearly Robert was dead. So I called Howard. He came. And I called a funeral home uptown that I'd come to trust in my work ministering to people with HIV/AIDS. And their staff arrived in a van. They kind of knew me because I'd used them a lot. And when they came in the room, I thought, this is where we're going to really have trouble. These people are going to come in. Robert is lying on the futon, fully dressed, well-polished shoes, not emaciated, not looking sick. And they're going to say, we're calling the police. And I really expected that to happen, but it didn't. And they put him on a stretcher, carried him down 5 flights, and I helped. And they went by the doctor's office there on 5th Avenue, and he signed the death certificate. So in the ensuing days, I was in 2 completely opposing frames of mind. Part of me felt frightened and guilty that I'd participated in something that was not yet legal in New York State. I really thought there was going to be trouble. But another part of me was proud for having stood by Robert in a time of deep need and crisis, regardless of possible consequences.
Take a few moments of quiet reflection, sit with the story, And then we'll have some time for questions. So if a question emerges for you, we'll take a few moments for that. But let's just sit with the weight of this story.